Morning. Boy, it's a beautiful, sunny, hot day today, isn't it? Solomon begins the third chapter of Ecclesiastes with the words, "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven." And then he goes on to write a list of various activities illustrating his point, writing, there's a time to be born, and there's a time to die, there's a time to plant, there's a time to harvest, and then on he goes, listing 12 more lines like those first two, for a total of 28 different activities. And even though sleep doesn't make it on the list, I would think most of us would agree, there's a time, right? There's a time to sleep, there's a time to be awake. And more than that, I think we would all agree there are good times to go to sleep, and there are good times to be awake. And man, don't you hate it when you're thinking, this would be a good time to go to sleep, and you just can't? Don't you just hate that? I mean, any of you ever struggle with falling asleep? It's okay to raise your hand in church. Yeah? Sure you have. Most of us, if not all of us, we've done that. We've laid down thinking, man, this would be a great time to get some rest. But instead of dozing off, we just lay there. And we're staring at the ceiling and sleep's not coming. And maybe, we're looking around the room and we're noticing things we've never noticed, or haven't noticed for a long, long time. Maybe we do the old flip and pound the pillow thing, maybe we grab a boring book to read. We go to the church's website and put on one of the preacher's messages. I don't know, but I think, we struggle, don't we, at times? We struggle with falling asleep. What about staying awake? You ever struggle to stay awake? Yeah, maybe you've been studying for hours. And you just, in the process of all that studying, you just have a real hard time staying awake. I remember in college, being introduced to no-dose pills. That's like one of those little caplets got 200 milligrams of caffeine. It's like drinking 4 Mountain Dews in one shot. 2 cups of black coffee, strong black coffee all at once. And I remember, trying to pull an all-nighter for this one test, getting drowsy, thinking, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to pop a no-dose. And I popped the no-dose, and about 20 minutes later, it didn't work at all for me. I think my body's immune to caffeine after all the soda I drink. Maybe you ate a Thanksgiving meal, right? And you had this wonderful Thanksgiving meal, and you're there sitting in the family room, in the living room with family. People, some of them you may haven't seen for months, and you're trying to stay awake. But, you can blame it on the tryptophan or maybe, it's just the reality that you've eaten a lot of sweet potatoes and, pumpkin pie and you're about to go into sugar coma, but you just can't stay awake. I think we've all had that. You ever struggle staying awake during a sermon? Oh, come on. Put the hands up. Come on, I know. I know. You all know I can see you, right? I've seen the head bobbing thing, I've seen the let's make it look like I'm praying thing. I've seen all that. I've seen the side pokes. I've seen the Bible drops, the cell phone drops. I've seen all that. Heard a story this week about this preacher. He's at a town council meeting, and the moderator of the meeting told him, he said, okay, preacher, you got a couple of minutes, you can say a few words. And now, if you know anything about preachers have a hard time saying a few words. And this guy started talking, and the 2 minutes became 3, became 4, became 5, became 6. Around the 7-minute mark, the moderator of the meeting tried to send a subtle hint to the preacher, hey, it's time for you to sit down and be quiet. Kind of cleared his throat a couple. But the preacher didn't take the hint. Or he just ignored it. And he just continued to ramble on. And the moderator of the meeting became more and more annoyed as more time passed. At the 10-minute mark, the moderator tapped his gavel lightly a few times. And the preacher just continued to ignore it. At the 15-minute mark, he smacked the gavel down 3 or 4 times really hard. And the preacher kind of looked at him and smiled, nodded his head, and just kept going. And he just kept going and going, and the moderator's getting more and more aggravated. At the 20-minute mark, he just starts rapping the gavel. And the preacher doesn't stop, doesn't ignore it. Finally, in his frustration, he takes the gavel and he throws it at the preacher. Well, he just misses him, and he hits this elderly man who was sitting there in the front row with that gavel. Well, the older guy sitting in the front row, he had fallen into a deep, deep sleep as that preacher just kept going on and on and on. And getting hit by the gavel, it woke him up, and he looked down at the gavel, looked up at the preacher, looked over at the moderator and said, "Hit me again." He's still talking. That's not a true story, of course, but I understand. I can relate to our occasionally falling asleep in church. But here's the thing we need to see. Here's what we need to see this morning. We need to see that there's a huge difference between physically falling asleep in a church building and spiritually falling asleep as a church body. We've been looking in the book of Revelation, and this morning we're going to look at the letter to the church at Sardis, a church that had fallen spiritually asleep. The church of Sardis was kind of like, the driver that's dozed off at the wheel and has seriously veered off course and is headed towards disaster. And Jesus knows this church's situation, and he loves them deeply. And so he sends them this very serious wake-up call in order to give them a chance to wake up and avert tragedy. Let's read the letter to the church at Sardis, which Jesus dictated to the Apostle John. We find it in the first 8 verses of Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3. To the angel of the church in Sardis write, "These are the words of him who holds the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you're dead. Wake up. Strengthen what remains and is about to die. For I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. Remember, therefore, what you have received and heard. Hold it fast and repent. But if you do not wake up, I'll come like a thief, and you'll not know at what time I will come to you. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. They will walk with me dressed in white, for they are worthy. The one who is victorious will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out the name of that person from the book of life, but I will acknowledge that name before my Father and his angels. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." Now, from Jesus' words to this church at Sardis, I think it becomes clear, doesn't it, that reputations don't always match up with realities. Jesus said to the church at Sardis, he says, "You have the reputation of being alive, but you're dead." Through those words, Jesus reminds us that as a church body, we should be concerned about both our reputation and our reality. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard the Grimm brothers' story about the brave little tailor who, killed 7 flies with one blow of his hand. And then in celebration of his feat, he created a belt with the words 7 with one blow. And there were people who saw him wearing that belt around town, and they assumed that this tailor had killed 7 men with one blow. And so as a result, this tailor developed this reputation of being this really, physically tough guy, when in reality he wasn't physically tough. He was just clever. Well, that story reminds us that reputations have usually at least a little something of substance behind them. Well, the church at Sardis, it had this reputation of being alive. And my guess is that there was a point in time when the church at Sardis was in fact on fire for Jesus. That there was a time when it was a growing congregation. It was a church where the people just really threw themselves into worship. It was a happening church. It was a place where love and unity reigned, where more and more and more people were becoming followers of Jesus, where the people really cared genuinely and deeply for each other and for the community in which they lived. And I think as a result, they gained this reputation. in Sardis and in the area for being a church that was really alive and well and on the move. But over time, you see, that church's flame for Jesus had died down to the point where it was barely a glowing ember. Because apparently the love of Jesus and the passion, for bringing the lost to Christ had grown cold in the hearts of the majority of the people in that church. There were only a few left who possessed those things, or better yet, were possessed by those things. And it wasn't yet evident to the world what had happened within that church body. But Jesus knew. And that's why he said to them, he says, you have a reputation for being alive. But in reality, you're on a fast track to shutting your doors and disbanding. And Jesus' words, I think here, they ought to make us wonder as a congregation, what are we known for? Well, in the community, in the area, what are we known for? Are we known for what Jesus wants us to be known for? Do we have a good reputation in the community? Do we have a bad reputation in the community? Do we have no reputation in the community? Does our reputation, whatever it is, does it match up with our reality? We ought to be asking ourselves things like, what can we do? What can we do to improve our reputation? What can we do to improve our reality? What can we do to help make this body of believers more like the body of believers Jesus wants it to be? And I think more specifically, we ought to be asking our individual selves, are there things that I can do, that I can personally do to help improve this church's reputation? Are there things that I can do to help Central become more like Jesus wants it to be? Now, a second message that I feel Jesus is sending to us through this letter to Sardis is the message to keep on working. To keep on working. As a church body, keep on working because your job's not done. Jesus said to Sardis, he said, I have found your works to be incomplete, not quite finished in the sight of my God. Every indication is that the church at Sardis started off very well, but instead of seeing things through to completion, somewhere along the line they just threw in the towel and they just kind of quit. Dr. Havner wrote, spiritual ministries often go through 4 stages: a man, a movement, a machine, and then a monument. Well, we're not sure who the man was behind the church at Sardis. A lot of people think it was Paul, but it could have been somebody else. We're not really sure. But at some point, there was someone who loved Jesus and who was on fire for God's work, who started this church in Sardis. And in the process, that person started a movement. More and more people, as he talked to them about Christ, became followers of Jesus. And they latched on to the mission and the vision of that individual. And so the church began to grow in Sardis. But then after a while, as time continued to roll on, their love for Jesus and the initial gratitude that they had in their hearts and minds for their salvation and their passion for the lost over time, it just kind of began to dwindle. And that's when they transitioned from movement to machine. They continued to go through the motions of serving and worshiping, but their hearts just really weren't in it any longer. And you see, at that point, they were well on their way to becoming a monument. Kind of reminds me of this one church I heard about. I mean, you talk about a group of believers that really lack spiritual excitement. One Sunday morning, someone passed away in the worship service. And a 911 call was made, and within minutes the place was crawling with police and EMTs. And get this, okay, they were in the process of rolling out a fifth person before anybody spoke up and pointed out to them where the really deceased person was. Now, you know that really didn't happen. But you do know also, right, that sometimes people's passion for God and the things of God, it tapers off. And it grows cold. That's, you see, apparently what happened in Sardis. We're not sure why. We don't know why they lost their passion. Maybe it was, fear of persecution. It's not mentioned. Maybe false teachers had come in and poisoned their minds, We just don't know. Maybe the excitement of initially entering into that relationship with Jesus had been reduced to, ritual and routine. I think it's very possible that they had just grown tired and bored of doing the same things the same way. Some commentators write that they became comfortable in their faith. Others say they became complacent. Some feel that they slowly transitioned from a church that was outward focused to a church that became inward focused. From being mission-minded to being socially minded, socially club mentality there. For whatever reasons they had, they stopped doing what they've been doing at first, and they were leaving works of ministry undone. And Jesus advises them, hey, remember, bring back into your heart and mind what it was in you that first lit that fire, and hold on to that. And he also advised them to repent. Not only to remember the things that they had at first, but also to repent, to change the direction they were headed. You see, they were falling into a deeper and deeper sleep spiritually, and Jesus advised them, hey, you need to wake up before it's too late. Because if you don't wake up, if you just keep approaching things spiritually in such a sluggish way, if you keep on pushing that spiritual doze button, you're going to end up pushing it one too many times. Only to wake up and find out that your church is no longer there. The very idea that Jesus would do away with the local church body, that may sound strange to us. And it ought to make us think, why? Why would he ever do such a thing? I'll tell you why I think Jesus would do such a thing. I think Jesus would rather a wayward church like the one at Sardis, I think he would rather that type of church close its doors than to have it to remain open and give people who come into it the wrong idea about what the church is and what the church really does. Like I said, it just kind of appears that this church at Sardis was no longer, an outward-focused mission church, but it had become an inward-focused social club. Friends, understand this. Getting together socially as a church, that's one of those good things that can become a bad thing. Getting together socially as a church body is a good thing, but it can become a bad thing. And it becomes a bad thing when it becomes the main thing. And really, you see, that's where this church at Sardis had slipped up. They had failed to keep the main thing the main thing. And Jesus was telling them, man, you need to wake up. You need to wake up and you got to see what's going on here. Or I'm going to have to shut you down. You see, friends, Jesus wants the church to be the church, not just something that somewhat resembles it. And he wants us to understand he has work for his church to do. As long as there's one person in the entire world that hasn't been reached with the message of Jesus Christ, friends, there's work for the church to do. As long as there's one Christian individual who hasn't yet reached complete spiritual maturity, there is work for the church to do. As long as there's one hungry mouth in the world to feed, there's work for the church to do. And we could go on and on. As long as there's one person chemically addicted, as long as there's one person still being victimized by sexual abuse, and on, we could go. There is work for the church to do. And Jesus wants us as a church body to remember, hey, there's work for you to do. And I want you to keep on doing it. Don't allow yourself to grow bored or become tired or become complacent. Work is necessary and it needs to be done. Rest from the work, that'll come. But now's not the time. This isn't the time to rest, church. It's not the time to sleep, it's the time to work. And that brings us to a third message, which I believe Jesus is sending us through this letter to Sardis, which is the fact that Jesus does not want to close. He doesn't want to shut down any of his congregations. And he doesn't, if you take it a step further, he doesn't want to lose any of his followers. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, where we're told, be self-controlled and alert. And then in the words that follow, we're given the reason why. It's because, as Peter wrote, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. We see through this letter to the church at Sardis, Jesus is reminding us, hey, understand, people, there's a spiritual war going on in this world that's being masterminded against me by Satan. And that's why Jesus is so passionate and so intense in his words. He's saying to those Christians in the first century, and he's saying to Christians of every age, listen to me. You just simply cannot fall asleep while you're on duty. Show some self-control. Do what you got to do to wake yourself up and to remain alert. Otherwise, your enemy may come in and take you by surprise. And Jesus is saying, I'm telling you this because I don't want to lose you. There's an interesting, I think, historical side note about Sardis. You know, the city of Sardis knew what it was like to be taken by surprise because it had happened to them. Not once, but twice. There's a few different versions out there that exist on how it happened, but in one of them, the story's told that they were caught by surprise when attackers climbed the steep, sheer slopes of the mountain that their city was built against. The way I understand it, the city of Sardis was built on a mountain peak. And what they did was they built it along the side of the mountain, and the one side of it was like a sheer, mountain sheer, very sharp, rock, very difficult to climb and get up. And what they did is they built a city in front of that, on the back side of that, and then they built walls on the three sides of the city, and they just assumed that mountain sheer would act as a fourth wall. In fact, the assumption was so strong that the king of the city, according to the stories, he didn't even post a guard to watch the mountain slopes because they were so sheer. He thought, there's nobody going to do that. Nobody's going to come up that direction. And what happened was, over the course of time, some of Sardis' enemies, they would come, and those walls on the cities were built such a way and were guarded so well that they tried, attacking those three walls over and over, and they were unable to siege the city through the walls. And since they couldn't come over the walls, at one point in time, one of their enemies decided, you know what? Let's try the backside. Let's go to the mountain sheers. Now remember, they were so confident that no one would ever do that, they didn't even post a guard. And so that army, when they came, no one saw them coming. And the next thing you know, that they got in and they overthrew the city. Another story is told about how the city was taken. It's a lot more colorful. And in that story, an enemy soldier was watching, one of the soldiers of Sardis who was posed on the wall, on guard duty. And he's watching him as he noticed that the guy was struggling to stay awake. And he watched him as he's, standing there and he's nodding off. And then at one point, he eventually just completely dozed off, and in the process, his helmet fell off, and he hit the ground in front of the wall. Well, that enemy soldier ran and he grabbed the helmet. And then, according to the stories, later, he used that helmet as a disguise at night, which enabled him to get into the city. He made his way to a secret entrance that was built in the wall, and enemy soldiers rushed in and captured the city. Well, it's very likely that Jesus was appealing to the people's sense of loss from their past. I think Jesus is saying to them, hey, you know what it's like to be caught off guard. You know what it's like, to be attacked and invaded and being overthrown, in an unexpected way. You've lost lives, you've lost family members, you've lost friends, you've lost the city because of your failure to be on very careful watch in the past. And Jesus is saying to this church at Sardis, look, I don't want to lose any of you. I don't want to lose souls in this city because of that same reason. And so to the majority of those Christians in that church who had spiritually kind of been dozing off, Jesus was saying, hey guys, wake up. Wake up. Become spiritually alive and active again. Remember how much I love you. Remember I gave my life for saving your souls and the souls of those people around you. Think of what's at stake. And wake up. And friends, the fact is, not only does Jesus not want to lose any of his local church congregations or any of his followers, the reality is Jesus doesn't want to lose anybody. He doesn't want to lose anybody. That's a fourth message that we get from Jesus that comes to us in this letter. He doesn't want to lose anyone. I imagine every single one of us have heard preachers who have encouraged us to make John 3:16 a very personal thing. By substituting, our name in there instead of using the word world, using your own name. For God so loved the world, and you say, for God so loved Darren. Okay? Or whatever. You insert your own name. I think we've all probably, heard that and done that kind of thing. And I think there's value in doing that. I do think there's some value in doing that because it reminds us that God loved us so much. That if we were the only person, he loves us this much, if we were the only person in the entire world who ever sinned, he would still have sent Jesus. I believe that. I believe he loves us that much. But I've heard people encourage people to do that, but something I really don't recall other preachers encouraging people to do is something I want to encourage you to do. I want to encourage you to think of a family member or a friend or a neighbor or a classmate or a coworker. Think of someone that you know, someone that you have some interactions with who's not a Christian at this moment, or maybe is a Christian who has strayed away from the church and been straying away from faith, and maybe they've become spiritually sleeping. I want you to think of that person and replace the words "the world" in John 3:16 with their name. And what I want to encourage you to do is repeat John 3:16 and say, for God so loved, and put that person's name right there, that he gave his one and only son. And just say that verse 3 or 4 times with that person's name in it. See if it doesn't cause your heart to do a double take. See if it just doesn't do something to your spirit. I did that. I've done it in the past. I did it again this past week with some different people's names. And I became somewhat emotional in the process. But more than that, friends, more than just rousing my emotions as I did that, it led me to pray for those people. And it's got me to thinking, what can I do besides pray? And so I'm praying for those people, but I'm also in my prayer asking God, what can I do? Is there something I can do at this point in my life in context with that person, in connection with that person, to maybe help change the situation? Is there a way I can plant a seed? Is there something I need to do, something I haven't done that I should be doing? What can I do, Lord? And I just encourage you to do the same. To just take that person's name that the Lord lays on your heart and mind and insert it into John 3:16, repeat it several times, and then talk to God about it. Lift that person up in your prayers, and then ask God, is there something I need to do, something I should do? What can I do, Lord, to maybe help change this situation? Use me in whatever way you would have me to be used. As our worship team returns to the stage, I just want to share one other thought with you from this letter. Another message from Jesus to his followers in this letter. And that message is this: those who remain faithful to me will enjoy everlasting life with me in the kingdom of heaven. And I will acknowledge them before my Father and his angels. I don't know about you, but I have found through the years that certain descriptive phrases that you find in the Bible just really appeal to me. I mean, like when the Bible talks about David and it says, David was a man after God's own heart. I read that phrase and I think, wow, man, I would love it. I would love to be known as a man after God's own heart. I hear, the phrase about Enoch, that Enoch, walked faithfully with God. And I think, man, I would love to be known as the person who walked faithfully with God. I hear how Peter describes Noah as a preacher of righteousness. And I think, wouldn't it be great if my legacy was to be thought of as a preacher of righteousness? But of all the descriptive phrases that I've come across in the Bible, the one that has always resonated the most with me is where the Bible says of Abraham, and he was called a friend of God. And it dawned on me, folks, as I was looking at this letter, that's what Jesus is saying to us at the end of this letter. When Jesus says he will acknowledge the name of each victorious person before the Father and his angels, what I think he's saying to us through this letter, he's saying, if you put your hope and trust in me, and you keep it right there, to the moment of your death or to that moment when I return, whichever comes first, not only am I going to welcome you into the kingdom of heaven, not only am I going to greet you with the words, well done, good and faithful servant, but I'm going to announce you. I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to proclaim you to the Father and his angels in heaven that this is my friend. Think about it. Think about that. Could anything be better than that?